Looking for Gadamer, traditions and transformations. The conversation that we are in is one that never ends. No word is the last word, just as there is no first word. Every word is itself an answer and gives rise always to a new question. Hans Georg Gadamer. To many, the works of Charles Darwin and Hans Georg Gadamer will seem unrelated. Whereas one toiled in the fields of natural discovery, the other immersed himself in the libraries of textual exegesis. However, there is a deep and shared theme to their work. They both refused to accept that reliance on scientific method did or could lead the way to human understanding. For both, there is no fixed form, core function, or overarching goal to which social life is supposed to conform. Both embrace a thoroughly historicized and contingent view of human life as a perpetual struggle in which form, function, and goal are never given but shift and vary with context and over time. At bottom, neither Darwin nor Gadamer believes that science can offer much help in meeting political and moral challenges. In an important sense, what Darwin did for biological sciences, Gadamer has done for the human sciences. While references to Gadamer's writings in legal theory are relatively few and far between, their influence is profound. The fact that the understanding of law as an interpretive exercise in which judges must grapple with fixed texts in a changing historical context has become a matter of trite learning is largely due to his influence. Gadamer turns around jurists' preoccupation with taking the judge out of judging. Although he recognizes that judging is a human art as opposed to a scientific undertaking, as do almost all contemporary jurists, he also insists that not only can personal values not be subordinated to objective and neutral decision-making, but also that such values are and should be at the heart of the adjudicative function. For Gadamer, legal interpretation is an inevitably political and thoroughly historicized undertaking. As he states in his magnum opus, Truth and Method, just as there is undoubtedly no understanding that is free of all prejudices, so the certainty achieved by using scientific methods does not suffice to guarantee truth. In continuing my critical account of the common law tradition of judging, I contend that Gadamer's hermeneutics can be utilized to offer a more radical and transformative reading of the common law tradition. By treating truth as their historicized experience of meaningfulness, he confirms that legal interpretation cannot be equated to abstract analysis or scientific method. It is only brought and re-brought to life in the active and persisting conversations between real people within, over, and across time. In this way, the common law becomes as much a historical location for these continuing interventions as a reliable resource of completed resolutions. Insofar as the common law is a tradition, it is a dynamic tradition of transformation. Indeed, Gadamer cautions that, while people exist and thrive within a tradition, it is still in the nature of people to be able to break with tradition, to criticize and dissolve it. p. 37. Indeed, Gadamer concedes that his hermeneutic universalism in emphasizing and giving priority to the past and tradition does run the risk of having a lack of ultimate radicality. p. 37. However, Gadamer insists that this may be the price that has to be paid in order to establish meaning in people's lives. What people need is not just the persistent posing of ultimate questions, but the sense of what is feasible, what is possible, what is correct, here and now. p. 38. By my lights, this is both an unnecessary and unwise concession. The fear that radicality must be synonymous with the nihilism that Nietzsche prophesied, p. 38, is unwarranted. On the contrary, it is both possible and desirable to run the risk of ultimate radicality, rather than seek to confront the ever-intensifying criticism of what has gone before with something of the truth of remembrance, with what is still and ever again real. p. 38. It is better to abandon truth and remembrance entirely. So disencumbered, people might step forward into the real and the what is yet to come in the exciting hope of contributing to the work in progress of law, tradition, and politics. Accordingly, I offer an account of what hermeneutical tradition and legal practice might look like and how it may be appreciated if the radicality of the hermeneutical insight was not cabined or contained. Although Gadamer tries to resist the charge that his work has legitimated a prejudice in favor of existing relations, p. 566, I maintain that Gadamer and his juristic followers, no matter how noble or progressive their intentions, have managed to curb rather than cultivate the critical and emancipatory instinct. p. 567. Accordingly, this chapter consists of 5 parts. In the first part, 1 introduce the hermeneutical turn in jurisprudence. In the second, I estimate the basic thrust of Gadamer's intervention. In the third part, I canvass the different takes on Gadamer and offer my own particular cut on the Gadamerian insight. Next, I explore the central concept of tradition and critique its customary understanding in the common law. In the fifth part, 1 develop the idea that law is politics and that anything might go. Throughout the chapter, My interpretation of Gadamer is controversial and not to everyone's taste. However, mindful of the concluding words to truth and method that it would be a poor hermeneuticist who thought he could have, or had to have, the last word, p. 579. I celebrate Gadamer in what I believe is the best and most respectful way. Challenging the textual letter of Gadamer's writings in a subversive spirit of Gadamer's hermeneutics, I treat Gadamer's answers as provoking, not precluding new questions and, perhaps, inviting and producing new answers. In this way, in contrast to most contemporary jurisprudential scholarship, I contend that Gadamer's hermeneutics can be utilized to explore what it means to treat law seriously as a living and transformative rhetorical tradition of evolution. Truths and methods. There is a growing lack of faith in the capacity of scholars to live up to the expectations that they have created. That reason is able to confront power and to deliver general truths that can ground specific efforts at human improvement. Although this critique has come from several quarters, a major source of this challenge has been the field of hermeneutics. Scholars have begun to take seriously the idea that truth is beholden to the discursive regimes through which it is apprehended and validated. Concepts such as truth, coherence, and objectivity, it is suggested, are best understood as internal to the historical debates over so-called theory and not as some external set of discursive categories available to validate particular theoretical conclusion to such debates. Thus, theorizing becomes not an attempted escape to some esteemed realm of pure thinking, but rather an engaged effort to understand the social entanglement and linguistic situation of thinking itself. In advocating a shift from epistemological truth to rhetorical knowledge, this hermeneutical critique of the traditional philosophical enterprise has been developed and expressed in many different ways. Nevertheless, a central division between these critics is the extent and force of the hermeneutical insight. Having set in motion a powerful antidote to traditional thinking, is it possible to contain it such that it does not impugn and invalidate the whole theoretical exercise? This is because, in its more extreme form, the charge is that, under the tutelage of a postmodern sensibility, philosophy has become a pasquinade of itself in which reason is reduced to customary ways of thinking, truth has become opinion, and objectivity is no more than consensus. Deprived of a philosophical recourse to the reassuring epistemological terrain of objective truths, mainstream jurists have been obliged to reassess their whole intellectual strategy. Jurists must now question not only the truth of legal nature and its objective ascertainment, but also the nature of truth and objectivity themselves. This combative encounter has taken place on the site of the common law. Jurists have locked theoretical horns over the nature of law in a system in which responsibility for its ascertainment and development, even in matters of constitutional doctrine, is entrusted to judicial officials. In a social world in which judges are increasingly asked to resolve some of its most morally contentious and politically fraught issues, it is considered as important as it has ever been that law be able to claim an institutional legitimacy and intellectual authority for itself that will be respected by the competing moral and political factions. There must be something objective and neutral about adjudication and law that sets it apart, however slightly, from the partisan conditions of moral and political debate. The central question for contemporary jurisprudence has become whether this traditional project of mainstream theorizing can withstand the corrosive implications of the hermeneutical insight. Of course, the response has been predictably varied. While some have imitated the ostrich and stuck their head deeper in the philosophical sand, others have redoubled their epistemological efforts to defend the philosophical establishment against the hermeneutical menace, and still others have sought to utilize the hermeneutical insight as further grist for the nihilistic mill. Although each response deserves a full and sustained treatment, I concentrate on the response that claims to take the hermeneutical insight seriously. Unfazed by the implications of the hermeneutical insight, these jurists embrace it as providing an exciting opportunity to place the adjudicative and jurisprudential enterprises on a much more secure and defensible footing. While there are obvious differences among these hermeneutical converts, they are united in their conviction that hermeneutics demonstrates that, rather than the common laws being an entity and adjudications being a science, it is as much a process or practice as anything else. It is an argumentative tradition that cannot only balance the competing demands of stability and change but also do so in a way that respects the important distinction between law and politics. For these jurists, the hermeneutical insistence that rhetorical knowledge must replace epistemological truth as the touchstone of valid theorizing is the making, not the breaking, of the jurisprudential project. Hermeneutics concerns itself with language and thought. It is an attempt to explore that space between words and thoughts in which confusion and misunderstanding can take hold. It is not only that there is an ineradicable gap between ideas and utterance, it is that each seems to inhabit the other so thoroughly that one does not stand prior to or independent from the other. Ideas and words are, if not entirely reducible to each other, so intertwined that any attempt to concentrate on one without the other is destined to result in less, not more, understanding. All of this would be difficult enough if such efforts took place in immediate, face-to-face encounters in a static world, but they become even more problematic when it is recalled that they occur in a world constantly on the move. This means that intentions, words, meanings, and ideas begin to slip and slide. As communication is a social practice, efforts to say what you mean and mean what you say are hostage to the social and political forces that are in play as history moves onward. In a manner of speaking, because history never sleeps, you, say, and mean are always works in progress such that attempts to treat them as finished or finishable are misguided and misleading. Moreover, while the difficulty of expressing oneself with clarity and certainty is a stiff enough challenge, talking about hermeneutics is a doubly difficult endeavor. As an area of study that might broadly be understood as being concerned with the principles of interpretation, once specifically biblical, now generally textual, there is the delicious and frustrating problem of interpreting the meaning of work that is itself about the task of interpreting meaning. Accordingly, in entering the field of hermeneutical scholarship, a certain willingness to put in play one's basic ideas about language and meaning seems to be a necessary price of admission. Unfortunately, too many see this less as an inexpensive opportunity for enlightenment and more as a costly toll on clear thinking. To my mind, this begrudging and frankly insecure way of proceeding is especially evident in the jurisprudential reception given to the writings of Hans Georg Gadamer. Rather than recognize the non-traditional and critical thrust of his work, jurists contrive to interpret and utilize him in the most traditional and uncritical fashion. Nevertheless, whatever might be made of Gadamer's writings and ideas, it seems to be almost universally accepted that his work has a central place in the extant canon of hermeneutical writings. Writing in mid-century, he set himself the daunting task of confronting the imposing German tradition of hermeneutical scholarship and of wresting it from the suffocating grip of its metaphysical mindset. Much of his argumentation is devoted to engaging with central ideas and thinkers in the German tradition, especially Wilhelm Dilthey, Immanuel Kant, G. W. F. Hegel, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and, latterly, Jürgen Habermas. Gadamer's basic objective is to demonstrate that scientific method is neither the controlling nor even a helpful model for hermeneutical understanding. He does not offer a competing metric for hermeneutical understanding that can direct or control in the same way as the reputed scientific method, but he insists that hermeneutics is an art and not a mechanical process. p. 191. Instead of trying to construct a critical rationality that will do service in the humanities in the same way and to the same effect as in the sciences, his work is presented as more a methodical corrective than a correct method, in which perhaps there is, properly speaking, no method, but rather a certain way of acting. p. 26. Although his work is obscure in parts and highly philosophical in scope, Gadamer's ideas are, or, at least, should be, of particular interest to jurists and lawyers. Rather than treat the problems of legal interpretation as secondary or exceptional aspects of the hermeneutical enterprise, he places the interpretive problems of jurisprudence squarely at the heart of his own hermeneutical project. Legal hermeneutics is no special case but is, on the contrary, capable of restoring the hermeneutical problem to its full breadth. p. 328. Emphasis omitted, and the texts of law are the preferred objects of hermeneutics, because they present the problem of awakening a meaning petrified in letters from the letters themselves. Accordingly, Gadamer's approach to law promises to be as stimulating and challenging as it is suggestive and disturbing. Looking for Gadamer. For Gadamer, language is the key to a proper understanding of the human predicament and condition. Arguing that language speaks us, rather than we speak it. p. 463. He maintains that language and thinking about things are so bound together that it is impossible to conceive of one without the other, or to imagine that language is a pre-given system of possibilities of being for which the signifying subject selects corresponding signs. p. 417. Although he commits himself to such a boldly discursive understanding of the human situation, he does not fall back into the stifling embrace of the metaphysical approach that views language as the fixed or stable grounding for human knowledge. Instead, he allies this basic insight to an equally important commitment to the historical movement of things. p. 285. For Gadamer, Language is a socially situated practice that can never entirely escape the historical confines of its usage either as an originating act or an interpretive apprehension. When this attachment to both language as the fundamental medium of human existence and historical contingency as a compelling feature of human existence are grasped in their general force and detailed operation, it becomes clear that Gadamer's account of the hermeneutical process is very different from the traditional one. Emphasizing the dynamic quality of both text and interpretation, Gadamer adopts an approach that is both dialogic and dialectical. It is dialogic in that it involves an active engagement between text and reader, and it is dialectical in that it demands a vigorous interplay between past and present. Hermeneutics is in the job of bridging, there, personal or historical distance between minds. Ph 95. Thus, the effort to achieve hermeneutical understanding is not a passive reflection on a completed object, it is an encounter with an unfinished event and is itself part of this event. P. 99. Consequently, there is no completed object of interpretation that is waiting to be discovered or revealed in its wholeness, but only the invitation to engage and play with it in the hope that meaning will be forged in that encounter. Accordingly, understanding is thought of less as a subjective act than as participating in an event of tradition, a process of transmission in which past and present are constantly mediated. P. 290. Indeed, performance is not peripheral or secondary to the text, but it is essential. P. 134. To any genuine attempt to understand the text's meaning, every performance is an event, but not one in any way separate from the work. The work itself is what takes place in the event of performance. P. 147. In the same way that reading music is, not, the same as listening to it. P. 148. So reflecting on law is not the same as applying it. Moreover, when this dynamic is properly understood, it will be appreciated that the occasion and site for its performance will become highly unstable and political in that the values and commitments that frame the interpretive act, what Gadamer calls prejudices, can never be ignored or disregarded. The task of interpreters, as opposed to prophets or proselytizers, is to gain some critical distance from their own prejudices. This is not so that such prejudices can be left behind, as there is undoubtedly no understanding that is free of all prejudices. P. 490, but so that they can be understood and recognized. However, consistent with his general hermeneutical schema, Gadamer emphasizes that there is no algorithm to distinguish the true prejudices, by which we understand, from the false ones, by which we misunderstand. So that the text, as another's meaning, can be isolated and valued on its own. 298-99. Emphasis in the original, the best that can be done is to guard against over-hastily assimilating the past to our own expectations of meaning. 305, and arbitrary fancies. P. 266. For Gadamer, therefore, it is a constant struggle to identify those foreconceptions or prejudices so that interpretation does not become enslaved to the tyranny of hidden prejudices that makes us deaf to what speaks to us in the tradition. P. 270. For Gadamer, therefore, this contextualized awareness will result in a shift in focus from technique and reflection to participation and engagement, in which from the hermeneutical standpoint, rightly understood, it is absolutely absurd to regard the concrete factors of work and politics as outside the scope of hermeneutics. Ph 31. This hermeneutical performance functions as kind of play in the sense of a to and fro movement that is not tied to any goal that would bring it to an end. Rather, it renews itself in constant repetition. P. 103. When understood in terms of legal interpretation, in which application is front and center, this playful encounter ensures that the gap between the text and its application can never be completely closed. P. 384, and works to establish a certain area of free play. P. 519, that always and necessarily breaks off in an open indeterminacy. P. 340. Indeed, for Gadamer, it is thanks precisely to its open indeterminacy that law is able to produce constant new invention from within itself. P. 498. In fulfilling their central task of deciding cases, judges must understand that there is not a two-step process of first understanding and then applying. The latter is part of the former because we cannot understand in the abstract or general but only in concrete and particular situations. Consequently, judging the case involves not merely applying the universal principle according to which it is judged, but co-determining, supplementing, and correcting that principle. P. 39. Such that a text must be understood at every moment, in every concrete situation, in new and different way. P. 309. In this way, Gadamer drives home his fundamental hermeneutical point that the law is always deficient, not because it is imperfect in itself but because human reality is necessarily imperfect in comparison to the ordered world of law, and hence allows of no simple application of the law. p. 318. Law and adjudication are both made possible and problematized by the normative dimension of interpretation. The common law gains its constancy and growth from the same source of interpretive performance. An important corollary of Gadamer's general theoretical position is that he has little truck with any metaphysical claims to the dominant authority of authorial intention in the hermeneutical engagement. It follows from his general orientation that every age has to understand a transmitted text in its own way. p. 198. A text's meaning does not depend only on the contingent situation of authors and their original audience, because those contingencies must themselves always be open to interpretation by the text's subsequent readers, constituted in a dynamic context and reconstituted in an equally dynamic but different context. The meaning of a text goes beyond its author, and that is why understanding is not merely a reproductive but always a productive activity as well. p. 296. For Gadamer, therefore, the passage of time or history is not so much the enemy of meaning but its enabling source. The hermeneutic task consists in not covering up the tension between the text and the present, by attempting a naive assimilation of the two but in consciously bringing it out. p. 307. This being the case, no text can be created so closed so that the space between saying and meaning can be entirely effaced such that there will be no room for future engagement, nor can there be a fixed or canonized performance that demands no future reinterpretation. Accordingly, while every interpretation strives to be correct, in view of the finitude of our historical existence, there is something absurd about the whole idea of a unique, correct interpretation. p. 120. In Gadamer's hermeneutical universe, the work presents and represents itself in its continuing performance such that its meaning will present itself so differently in the changing course of ages and circumstances. 120-21. When it comes to meaning, Gadamer is adamant that in truth, there is nothing that is simply there, because everything that is said and is there in the text stands under anticipations. Ph 121. So far, my presentation of the general themes in Gadamer's work, the importance of historical context and its contingency, the abandonment of scientific methodology in the humanities, and the performative dynamism of hermeneutical activity, will, I would hope, go largely unchallenged. Perhaps naively in light of the topic, I have sought to provide an introduction to Gadamer's ideas that is sufficiently general to garner broad approval. However, from a jurisprudential point of view, the subversive effect of such a basic approach to legal interpretation ought not to be underestimated. Gadamer has traditional jurists squarely in his sights when he insists on the entirely fluid, adamantly non-scientific, thoroughly contextual, and wholly performative quality of legal hermeneutics. The claim that valid or worthy legal work can be done in an exclusively mechanical or technical manner is rendered hopelessly inadequate. Although technical skills have their role, they can do little on their own. All interpretation has a social and political aspect that can only be hidden or ignored, not done away with. In this sense, we are all interpretivists now. Originalism, textualism, and literalism are each different and unconvincing ways of denying the interpretivist imperative. Whatever else he may be saying, Gadamer is telling lawyers that interpretation is an inevitably active and therefore political process. Lawyers cannot avoid working with and among the social forces that make interpretation both possible and problematic. It is not so much that the instability of those social practices and forces renders communication impossible, but that it ensures that the establishment of meaning will never be without difficulty or uncertainty. The foundations of language and therefore law will always be as contingent and shifting as the foundations of society and history. Nevertheless, any attempt to provide a more nuanced and less sweeping account of Gadamerian hermeneutics and its implications for jurisprudence soon finds itself in more contested critical waters. Beneath the relative calm of the surface, there is a seething mass of contending hermeneutical forces at work. This is where the courage and strength of different scholars' hermeneutical convictions are tested. When it comes to Gadamer's work, the central point of division is around how far it is possible or desirable to take his critical insights. Although there are a variety of possible interpretations, there are two general positions that can be taken. Is it that Gadamer has loosened the constraints on interpretation and, while forsaking the idea of a unique interpretation, remained within the gravitational pull of the metaphysical tradition that holds on to a traditional notion of hermeneutical truth, albeit more pluralistic and less hegemonic? Or is it that he has broken open the hermeneutical process to such an extent that any notions of truth are left in disarray and that, cut free from the metaphysical tradition, The interpretive process is not so much about truth and correctness as usefulness and persuasion. The pertinence of this division for jurisprudential debate is acute and obvious. On one side are those who believe that it is still practicable to talk about law and adjudication as separate from broader political debate. I call this the conservative approach. On the other side are those who, like myself, maintain that law and adjudication are one more site for political debate to take place. I will call this the radical approach. Again, this radical stance does not mean that anything goes. Rather, it recognizes that there are bounds to the hermeneutical enterprise, but that those bounds are always in play as part of the larger political game of life. A jurisprudential reading. The most well-known exponent of the conservative approach is Ronald Dworkin. Although his references to Gadamer are limited, it is apparent that his overall hermeneutical approach owes much to Gadamer's writings. Indeed, Dworkin gladly acknowledges as much when he notes that, in constructing his interpretive account of law and adjudication, I appeal to Gadamer, whose account of interpretation as recognizing, while struggling against, the constraints of history strikes the right note. While he has some reservations about whether Gadamer places the interpreter in too much of a subordinate position to the author and offers a too passive and unidirectional view of the hermeneutical encounter, many of the central motifs and ideas of Gadamer pervade Dworkin's own oeuvre. However, Dworkin relies on a very conservative reading of Gadamer. While Dworkin has done sterling work in demonstrating that adjudication is an inevitably creative and political undertaking, he still insists that judges can act in a way that is neither partisan nor unbounded. Adjudication is, or ought to be, a principled affair in which intellectual coherence triumphs over ideological partiality. Dworkinian judges have considerable leeway in their work, but they are ultimately bound by the brute facts of legal history and, in placing the legal past in the best political light possible, they are to operate on the assumption that, it was, created by a single author, the community personified. In this way, Dworkin puts Gadamer to work in the central contemporary jurisprudential problem of establishing the democratic legitimacy of legal adjudication on the basis of its being both institutionally constrained and politically just. As such, Dworkin's theory is the flagship of liberal legalism. It claims to offer a stable method by which to keep the law up to date and by which to distinguish right from wrong answers. Our less celebrated but more explicit effort to utilize Gadamer's work in jurisprudence is that of James. In a series of learned and lengthy pieces, he has striven to present a sophisticated account of legal hermeneutics that plays out in more detail and rigor the implications of Gadamer's approach for law and adjudication. The great strength of Mts's scholarship is that it has familiarized American theorists with Gadamer's work and has made a forcible case for its relevance to current problems of legal knowledge and judicial method. He makes Gadamer's work accessible and useful, but he retains its subtlety and richness. For Mts, Gadamer's major contribution to jurisprudence is the insistence that law is a rhetorical practice and that any efforts to appreciate adjudication must recognize the important role that rhetoric plays in fashioning and critiquing legal knowledge. Nonetheless, although his earlier work retained the possibility of a more radical reading of Gadamer, his most recent essays have taken a distinctly conservative turn. For all the good work that Mts's efforts do, they are overshadowed by his willingness to put them in the service of an epistemological project that still clings to the possibility of reliable methods and dependable truths. According to Mts, while Gadamer has decisively demolished any possibility for a science of correct interpretation and loosened the reins of hermeneutical authority, he has not abandoned the hope of developing a rigorous logic or art of rational interpretation that will be able to sanction some interpretations as clearly better than others by stint of its own rhetorical standards. In making a plea for greater attention to rhetoric in jurisprudential inquiry, Mts contends that rhetoric is defined not as a grudging resignation from the false hopes of a rigorous philosophy of truth, nor as a celebration of boundless and playful irrationalism, but instead as a disciplined encounter with the activity of rhetorical knowledge. In a particularly arresting and ambitious essay, Mts seeks to stake out and colonize this middle ground between the barren conceptualism of legal positivism and the excesses of a postmodern critique, drawing directly on the work of Gadamer as well as Chamberlain to substantiate the claim that natural law philosophy and philosophical hermeneutics have significant points of convergence. He proceeds to propose a defense of legal hermeneutics that is committed to reinvigorating, even if in grammatically new form, the natural law tradition. By this, Mts intends to portray legal practice as a hermeneutical conversation that contains the conditions and resources for its own legitimate elaboration and critique. Thus, law is both a rationally bounded and politically responsive enterprise in which issues of legal validity and moral acceptability are blended rather than separated. Picking up where Alan Fuller left off and Lloyd Weinreb has recently taken up, Mts leaves little doubt about the breadth or depth of his intellectual ambitions to construct a full-blown theory of law and justice from the generous quarry of Gadamer's hermeneutics. Gadamer's hermeneutical ontology implies a rhetorically based epistemology, a set of guiding principles by which legal practice can be assessed and criticized, even if without scientific precision and determinacy. Gadamer provides the theoretical backing for the practices that constitute law within flux, not in the sense of authorizing those practices from a privileged perch of reason, but in the sense of drawing general conclusions about the contours of those practices and describing how those practices may be fostered. In an important sense, his natural law move should come as no surprise. After all, Dawkins has been profitably pursuing a similar line for the past 2 decades. However, apart from the candor and naivete of Mtz's approach, it is the fact that he uses Gadamer as his primary grounding source that startles. There can be no doubt that there is ample textual support for this particular conservative reading of Gadamer. Truth and Method is replete with references and remarks that give support to such an interpretation. Notwithstanding the dynamic and dialogic quality of interpretation, Gadamer contends that there are occasions on which interpreters will be pulled up short by the text. p. 268. The important thing is to be aware of one's own bias, so that the text can present itself in all its otherness and thus assert its own truth against one's own foremeanings. p. 269. Although perfect legal dogmatics is untenable, legal certainty and predictability can exist because it is in principle possible to know what the exact situation is. p. 329. This is because, according to Gadamer, the text has a certain obligatoriness that ensures that its interpretation cannot be free and arbitrary. p. 118. But is subject to the supreme criterion of right representation. p. 118. Which enables the meaning of the text to assert itself. p. 465. In this sense, Gadamer's own writings provide textual reassurance to the idea that interpretive creativity has its limits and they are to be found in the text itself. Neither the doctrinal authority of the Pope nor the appeal to tradition can obviate the work of hermeneutics, which can safeguard the reasonable meaning of a text against all impositions. p. 277. It is on these textual resources that Mtz anchors his conservative rendition of both Gadamer and the jurisprudential project. For all the touted experimental and inventive possibilities of interpretation, Mtz still presents legal hermeneutics as a conversational activity in which deferential interpreters await hermeneutical revelation from textual authorities. The interpreter does not adopt a subjective attitude of dominance over the text, but rather suppresses her subjective aims and attends to the saying of the historically effective texts as it is revealed in the particular circumstances. Nevertheless, there is much to applaud in Mtz's account. In concentrating on the vitality and motility of law as a professional practice and social phenomenon, he gives cogent voice to the rejection of the scientific impulse to reduce law to a disciplined methodology of deductive application, the embrace of the give-and-take experience of the interpreter within a given historical and social situation, and the emphasis on the interpenetration of the universal and the contextual. However, Mtz cannot or will not resist the almost overwhelming urge to shackle Gadamerian hermeneutics to the conservative wagon of mainstream jurisprudence. Indeed, Mtz takes for granted the central issue that divides conservative and radical jurists. Lawyers know very well that argumentation is a bounded and rational enterprise that nevertheless cannot aspire to process of deduction from principles, even though the rhetorical conventions of legal practice and judicial opinion writing ironically work to conceal this, supposedly dangerous, fact. It is this very idea of boundedness and rationality that goes to the crux of the jurisprudential debate. To varying degrees, mainstream jurists, of whom Dawkins is the leading example, cling to the idea that the political debate that goes on within law is rendered bounded by the resources of law and disciplined by the universal constraints of rationality. In hewing such a rhetorical line, Mtz is a vast improvement on Dawkins as he is much less attached to truth and method. Indeed, for all his hermeneutical huff and puff, Dawkins is keen to develop an algorithm through which he can approve of some readings over others. Mtz has challenged those assumptions and shown that, as a rhetorical practice, law generates its own conventions of argumentation that establish the bounds of its own jurisdiction and the nature of its own rationality. As he puts it, rhetorical knowledge is a practical achievement that neither achieves apodictic certitude nor collapses into relativistic irrationalism. Rhetorical knowledge therefore sustains legal practice as a reasonable, even if not thoroughly rationalized, social activity. Nevertheless, although Mtz has managed to break freer of the epistemological grip of traditional philosophizing, he refuses to take the necessary steps to get beyond its cramping confines. In short, Mtz is still very much in the conservative game of looking for theoretical backing and establishing disciplined encounters. Rhetorical knowledge is a constitutive feature of legal practice that grounds any theoretical reconstruction and critique of that practice. Like Dawkins, wants to make law safe for lawyers by making legal practices understandable in their own right. Viewing law as intrinsically and irredeemably rhetorical reaffirms its integrity and legitimacy as a practice of securing reasonable adherence. Indeed, manages to put Gadamer to work in exactly the kind of foundational tradition that Gadamer purportedly criticizes and rejects. This turn to natural law, even if in grammatically new form, is exactly the wrong way to go. It emphasizes and works with those conservative elements of Gadamer's texts that comprise part of his approach, but are by no means exclusive or exhaustive in their interpretation. At one point in his argument, asserts that Fuller and Weinreb's natural law approaches are best viewed as elaborating the implications of philosophical hermeneutics in the context of legal theory and as proceeding in a manner that echoes Gadamer's postmodern philosophical claims. This is wild stuff because either Fuller and Weinreb have become postmodernists, an unlikely possibility, or postmodern has become distinctly unpostmodern in Mtz's hands, a more likely possibility. Indeed, Mtz seems to want to have it both ways, to open up the hermeneutical process to more pluralistic and historically engaged possibilities and to limit that process so that interpretation is not open-ended. Moreover, Mtz runs with those ideas into far-off places. It is not that I am claiming that Mtz has got Gadamer wrong, this would be a very non-Gadamerian idea. Instead, I argue that it is not a helpful place to take Gadamer. Mtz tends to head toward the very locations of essentialism, rationalism, and foundationalism that much of Gadamer's work seems best interpreted to abandon. Mtz seems to want to foundationalize Gadamer and use his hermeneutical account as a ground from which to defend the legal enterprise against the celebration of boundless and playful irrationalism. When this issue is addressed, it is instructive to note Gadamer's own views on the subversive and non-traditional aspects of his own writings. Presumably, in light of Gadamer's own arguments, the authority of the text's author is severely diminished. Indeed, it is surely a staple of Gadamerian hermeneutics that the author has little authority in controlling or constraining the future interpretation given to the text and that the reader's own prejudices or foreconceptions are inevitably in play. He insists that every age has to understand a transmitted text in its own way, p. 198, such that its meaning does not depend on the contingencies of the author and his original audience. For it is always co-determined also by the historical situation of the interpreter, p. 296. Accordingly, not just occasionally, but always, the meaning of a text goes beyond its author, and that is why understanding is not merely a reproductive but always a productive activity as well, p. 296. This does not mean that Gadamer has no part to play in the unfolding debate over the meaning of Gadamer's hermeneutical texts, only that he must engage with the debate and his own texts as a future reader, not as their past author. Moreover, it seems odd that those scholars who claim to be disciples of Gadamer's hermeneutics should read Gadamer's text in such an un-Gadamer-like way. As Gadamer insists, the meanings of texts do not present themselves for inspection. They must be created in the encounter between the text and its interpreter. The hermeneutic task consists in not covering up the tension between the text and the present, by attempting a naive assimilation of the two but unconsciously bringing it out. p. 307. As I understand it, this is not to claim that the reader is sovereign and unconstrained, only that the reader has an inevitable and decisive part to play in the hermeneutical encounter. Neither the text nor its author can have the last word in what the text will come to mean. That insight must be as apposite for interpreting hermeneutical texts as it is for interpreting any other kind of text. The problem is that, while Mtz and Gadamer, to a lesser extent, have historicized law and adjudication, they have only politicized it in the most superficial and sanitized way. If Gadamer and Mtz are right to chastise traditional philosophers and jurists for their failure to recognize the inevitable historicization of interpretation and dialogue, then I am right to chastise Gadamer and Mtz for their failure to politicize that inevitable historicization of interpretation and dialogue. There is something missing from such jurisprudential accounts, and that something is the matrix of ideological forces that drive this historical process of rhetorical tradition. In a manner of speaking, Mtz has identified the Gadamerian vehicle and traced its hermeneutical route, but he has offered no explanation of how it moves and what determines that route. It is a roadshow without gas or drivers. While Gadamer and Mtz each incorporate values into their rhetorical accounts of law, they do so in such a way that the passion and commitment with which they are held and presented are filtered out and converted into rational entities to be weighed and balanced on the rhetorical scales. The world of Gadamerian politics is a sterile and barren world in which the material dirt of ideological politics and interests has been washed off so that judges and rhetoricians do not get their hands soiled with life as it is actually lived. However, this sanitization misrepresents the grubbiness and messiness of the real social world. In so doing, And other conservative jurists ensure that such a hermeneutical approach can only succeed by pretending that it is operating in a non-ideological environment in which the reasonable has already been distinguished from the arbitrary, the disciplined from the anarchical, the stabilized from the fluxed, the authoritative from the irrational, and the playful from the serious. His Gadamer-inspired natural law program is abstract and arid. It is as much an escape from social life as the traditional philosophies that it claims to reject and replace. At the root of this problem is the central notion of tradition. The confrontation between text and reader takes place within a tradition or conversation that obliges the interpreter to filter out the productive and approved prejudices from the unproductive and arbitrary ones. In this sense, the tradition has a tendency to engulf and swamp the interpreter to such an extent that he or she becomes part of it. As Gadamer puts it, the hermeneutical game has a spirit of its own that masters the players and holds them in its thrall. p. 106. Explaining that the player experiences the game as a reality that surpasses him. p. 109. He goes so far as to conclude that the players no longer exist, only what they are playing. p. 112. However, these Gadamerian claims have jurisprudential purchase or plausibility only if it is assumed that the rhetorical tradition of law is sufficiently coherent and homogeneous to underwrite the evaluative claims that he makes for it. For instance, it isn't his assertion that, while legal practice is far from a technique that delivers exact knowledge, it can and does generate rhetorical principles to serve as aids in exercising good judgment when choosing between competing interpretations. In order for this critical function to be fulfilled, these principles must be sufficiently ordered, expansive, and determinate to do the work that is asked of them. However, in modern society as well as in law and jurisprudence, there are simply too many traditions and none that receive the general approval or sanction that would enable Mtz's proposal to fly. While Mtz is right to advance the argument that a just legal practice, like a life well lived, does not circle around a determinate truth, he is mistaken to conclude that such a practice spirals forward from a shared tradition in the form of reasonable judgments about how to proceed. When it comes to adjudication, difficulties tend to arise in those circumstances when there is no shared tradition and people are divided in their reasonable commitments. It seems a little hollow to recommend that such division should be mended or mediated through a resort to law's rhetorical traditions when the very existence of multiple or fractured traditions is what caused the problem in the first place. Consequently, tradition is not a grounding for anything if that means it can afford a solution, rather simply provide a site for competing views. As I seek to demonstrate, there is another reading of Gadamer's work that plays down its foundational side and plays up its more radical possibilities. Traditions and transformations. There are two general notions of tradition that tend to dominate and organize debate. One is premised on the unstated notion that there is something normatively compelling or worthy about what has come before. The past is not followed simply because it precedes, but because it is superior to present understandings accepted by earlier generations and having withstood the test of time. Tradition binds not simply because it has not been replaced or altered but because it has its own normative force. The past is not simply a store of information and materials but an obligatory source of value and guidance that is entitled to be given normative preference over present understandings and uninhibited ratiocination. The past is what fashions society into what is today, and the decision to respect it is what gives meaning to the lives of future generations. Viewing people as custodians rather than creators of tradition, this conservative Burkean approach talks in terms of the great primeval contract of eternal society in which the partnership between those who are living and those who are dead, and those who are to be born. The other approach maintains that, if there is to be genuine progress and emancipation, there must be a complete break from that past. This revolutionary stance is given expression in Marx's warning that the tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living and that progressive activity cannot draw its poetry from the past, but must let the dead bury their dead. In this view, whatever is normatively compelling about the past is oppressive. To escape its baleful influence, people must become the undertakers, not the custodians, of the past. There must be a complete rescission of the contractual partnership between past and future generations. Predictably, both of these polarized approaches are overstated and miss the mark. Burke's reverence for the past is as complacent as it is unrealistic, and Marx's condemnation of the past is as paralyzing as it is unrealizable. Both divert attention away from the available possibilities for change and transformation that always already exist within traditions and that cannot be expunged by even the most exhaustive or authoritative analysis. Marx's warning must be taken seriously in that the deadening force of tradition can cast a disabling pall over living efforts to improve the future, as must Burke's recommendation in that the past has much to offer that can be worthy of selective preservation. Although the Burkean appeal to tradition must be approached with skepticism and caution, Marx's plea is both impossible and unnecessary. It is impossible because there is no language or materials in the present from which to imagine a better future that are not passed on from the past. There is no way for people to step outside themselves to some elusive sight or state of mind that is untouched by the past. Fortunately, it is unnecessary to attempt such a prodigious feat because the past is neither so dead nor so determined as to occlude its poetic revitalization in aid of future imaginings. There is no shortage of opportunities for transformative creativity. Therefore, there is no need to embrace either the Burkean traditionalist or the Marxian anti-traditionalist stance. The celebration of tradition for its own sake or its condemnation for any other reason is a false dichotomy. This where Gadamer enters the picture. He offers an account of tradition, or, at least, the radical one that I intend to offer, that is much more nuanced and, therefore, much less dogmatic. In a more critical and suggestive account, tradition and transformation do not stand opposed, each feeds off and complements the other. In this way, as I am mindful that tradition is the living faith of the dead, whereas traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, my approach is about tradition but is not traditionalist, that is, in which continuity is valued over change, and it is about transformation but is not revolutionary, that is, in which change is preferred to continuity. I call this work in progress. The fact that there is no choice other than to follow and therefore live, at least in part, in the past says nothing about what it is in the past that we must follow or respect. To uphold a tradition does not mean that it has to be done in an uncreative or uncritical way. There is choice, and, therefore, politics are always in play. As Jacques Derrida puts it, that we are heirs does not mean that we have or that we received this or that, some inheritance that enriches us one day with this or that, but that the being of what we are is first of all inheritance, whether we like it or know it or not. Inheritance is an undertaking that those in the present are obliged to perform, but there is no one or only way to fulfill that definitive responsibility. What is given about any tradition is always open to appropriation and contestation, so resort to the past is therefore always and unavoidably political. There is no one monolithic and unified account of the past that stands in for history or that can claim to be the past's ineffable bruteness. Any attempt to justify a master narrative of the past, be it from a materialist right, a socialist left, a liberal center, or anywhere else, is destined to fail. It will be either so abstract as to ignore the contingent and nuanced facts or so detailed as to be little more than a literal recounting of those facts. Although the appeal to tradition is only meaningful if that tradition is sufficiently determinate and discrete, history shows that traditions are notoriously imprecise and that they are infuriatingly difficult to pin down. Like anything and everything else, traditions are not so much discovered as constructed in the act of following them. Moreover, because so much of the debate around tradition is less about its heterogeneity and more about the features that are seen to hold it together and that define its homogeneity, the ideas of tradition and transformation have come to be seen as antithetical. However, in most of life, and law, breaking with tradition is as traditional as it gets. Indeed, although he offers it more by way of caution than encouragement, Gadamer notes that, while people exist and thrive within a tradition, it is still in the nature of people to be able to break with tradition, to criticize and dissolve it. p. 37. Whereas Gadamer worked to contain that instinct, I work to nourish it. In the conventional understanding, tradition is held out as a dated accumulation of commitments, customs, and practices that are accepted with little room for critical examination or imaginative reformulation. In a more critical Gadamerian reading, tradition is not a dead thing of the past but a vital something of the present. People constantly participate in it and reconstruct it as they rely on it. Indeed, traditions survive by adaptation and change. If they do not change, they become ossified and die. In this way, traditions are alive, organic, and part of the present. They are not simply the flotsam and jetsam of the forward-moving ship of history as it steams into the future. Moreover, because traditions are understood as organic and social in that they are transmitted from one generation to another, change is at the dynamic heart of a genuine practice of tradition. As participants rely on the tradition, they are also contributing to and transforming that tradition. The circle of understanding is neither subjective nor objective, but describes understanding as the interplay of the movement of tradition and the movement of the interpreter. The anticipation of meaning that governs our understanding of a text is not an act of subjectivity, but proceeds from the commonality that binds us to the tradition. But this commonality is constantly being formed in our relation to tradition. Tradition is not simply a permanent precondition, rather, we produce it ourselves inasmuch as we understand, participate in the evolution of tradition, and hence further determine it ourselves. Thus the circle of understanding is not a methodological circle. p. 293. In this reading of Gadamer, The circle of understanding is historical and political. Traditions are neither fixed nor bounded and, in being passed on and assumed by individuals, they are constantly reworked and remade, as are the individuals who engage with them. The interpretation and application of a tradition is also an act of amending that tradition. The thing which hermeneutics teaches us is to see through the dogmatism of asserting an opposition and separation between the ongoing, natural tradition and the reflective appropriation of it. Ph 28. This means that following a tradition is not simply a matter of identifying a fixed continuity between the past and present but also involves certain rearrangements, ruptures, and reversals. This act of reconstruction is both deconstructive and reconstructive. Although there is always the risk of confirming that which is being deconstructed, the most respectful reaffirmation of the past's traditions is realized in constantly placing them under critical scrutiny and transforming their substance as their spirit is observed. If a tradition is to remain alive and relevant, its institutional guardians must negotiate a paradoxical task that is the constant source of both their reassuring empowerment and unsettling usurpation. They must work with and against the tension between memory, fidelity, the preservation of something that has been given to us, and, at the same time, heterogeneity, something absolutely new, and a break. Like the wicked, there is no rest or respite for these guardians. However, this is only a problem for those who mistakenly insist that change or newness is to be feared. Tradition and those assigned the task of interpreting it are works in progress whose character, if they have one, is to be always at work and always in progress. Such an appreciation is at the heart of great moments in most arenas of human endeavor. It is not the person who diligently and expertly upholds conventional standards and expectations that will be recognized as great, but those who transform those standards and expectations as they exceed them. The hallmark of genius is not simply the ability to beat everyone at their own game, but the capacity to envision and dictate a different game to be played. Pablo Picasso, James Joyce, and Albert Einstein had technical skills in abundance, but they also possessed a vision and capacity to reveal possibilities that others had not even seen or thought possible. While those rare moments of transformation reject certain traditions and conventional approaches, they operate within a broader tradition of creativity and originality that they reinforce and affirm in their evolutionary contributions. Indeed, such creative geniuses are exemplars of this idea that traditions are upheld by breaking them. It is not the substantive traditions themselves but the traditionality of change and innovation that they continue. Even the conservative T.S. Eliot, in his celebration of literary tradition, recognized that, when any individual's contribution is assessed, novelty is better than repetition. This credo of conservation and contestation of the past in a transformative tradition is adhered to by some of the great judicial innovators, treading a thin and, at times, non-existent line between heresy and heritage. They occupy a role that is part apostle and part apostate, in which they recognize that another present way of understanding the past is to imagine a better future. They accept that the legal past is not a foundation on which to build but a resource site from which to draw. Past legal decisions combine to form a valuable institutional almanac of experimental strategies whose relevance and results are to be tested and retested in the service of making society a better place to live. Those judges, Donegall's Lord Atkin, Hedley Burns Lord Reed, Griswold's Justice Douglas, and Lochner's Justice Holmes, who take most seriously the experimental imperative, are those who flaunt conventional standards in the process of reformulating them. Their judgments are the exceptions that prove the rule. Great judges of the common law tradition are those who refuse to be hampered by customary habits of judicial mind. The common law is a vast tradition of almost infinitely possible argumentative moves. What is actually done is never entirely justifiable by the principles or rules of the tradition alone of which it claims to be an application. A particular move cannot be detached from the overall tradition itself. Each can only be fully appreciated in the context of the other. Indeed, the idea that there is complete freedom to decide makes no sense at all, because it is only within a tradition of constraints, albeit thoroughly contingent and revisable in content and direction, that decision-making can be comprehended. While this understanding of tradition is to be contrasted to the pedant's or formalist's timidity and dependence on rules, it is also to be set off against the anarchist's bravado in ignoring all rules. Freedom and its ultimate exercise in genius is less about divine detachment and more about the transformation of the existing traditions in novel and disruptive ways. Moreover, the choice is not, as Mtz and others suppose it to be, between a disciplined encounter with the activity of rhetorical knowledge and a boundless and playful irrationalism. This is only to reinstall another false dichotomy between reason and non-reason. Consequently, legal reasoning is about the moves that are presently in play and which structure law's reasoning game in such a way as to enable choices between competing definitions of particular rules. However, while providing an argumentative context for reasoning and definition. These moves are themselves being contingently reworked. In this way, the rules of law's tradition do not so much constrain or cabin judges' room for maneuver as make it possible and operational. To be situated within a tradition does not limit the freedom of knowledge but makes it possible. p. 361. Viewed in this way, law is confirmed as a rhetorical activity, and legal tradition is not simply a process that is to be known and thereby governed. It is part of an active engagement in which tradition is a genuine partner in dialogue. p. 358. With its judicial interlocutors and, in engaging in the dialogue, both the tradition and the interlocutor are transformed into a communion in which they do not remain what they were. p. 379. When Gadamer states that, in a hermeneutical approach, understanding is thought of less as a subjective act than as participating in an event of tradition, a process of transmission in which past and present are constantly mediated. p. 290. I want to emphasize how the subjective act is not consumed by the tradition, but how the two interact. In the same way that the subjective act is not meaningfully comprehended or even possible outside the tradition, so the tradition does not stand independently of the subjective acts that create and recreate it. Furthermore, when Gadamer states that the hermeneutical challenge is that of acquiring an appropriate historical horizon, p. 303, I have no quarrels with this as long as appropriate is understood in a non-objective, political, and contingent way. Accordingly, rather than talk about obligation in the sense of a fixed meaning or talk about freedom in the sense of no fixed meaning at all, I find it better to think of the whole performance in a way that is both bound and free. In a certain sense, interpretation probably is recreation, but this is a recreation not of the creative act but of the created work, which has to be brought to representation in accord with the meaning the interpreter finds in it. p. 119. Although Gadamer is commenting on festivals, his remarks are opposite to the judicial encounter between law's tradition and the individual judge in reaching a discrete decision in a particular controversy. As a festival, it is not in identity like a historical event, but neither is it determined by its origin so that there was once the real festival, as distinct from the way in which it later came to be celebrated. From its inception, whether instituted in a single act or introduced gradually, the nature of a festival is to be celebrated regularly. Thus its own original essence is always to be something different, even when celebrated in exactly the same way. An entity that exists only by always being something different is temporal in a more radical sense than everything that belongs to history. It has its being only in becoming and return. p. 123. Under my portrayal of the common law tradition, not only is there no compelling justification why judges should rein in their own critical judgments and supposed deference to those implicit in law's substantive traditions, but there is also a cogent reason why they should give full and open expression to them. Judges respect the common law tradition best when they scrutinize, interrogate, challenge, and make it conform with justice. Of course, they do not do this from outside the tradition but work with and within the tradition. This idea is perfectly captured by Derrida when he states that, for a decision to be just and responsible, it must, in its proper moment if there is one, be both regulated and without regulation. It must conserve the law and destroy it or suspend it enough to reinvent it in each case, re-justifying it, at least reinvent it in the reaffirmation and the new and free confirmation of its principles. Accordingly, the style of judging that captures most faithfully the cherished traditions of the common law is one that involves both a constant reinterpretation of past decisions and a perpetual openness to future reinterpretation. And, of course, such a style of judging must equally question its own biases and implications. Nonetheless, if it is to be given its due, each new case is entitled to more than an unthinking reliance on existing doctrine or rules. It requires the judge to make a fresh judgment that actively reappraises as it reaffirms the traditions of legal doctrine. Indeed, contrary to conventional wisdom, it is the relentless critic who most closely grasps and continues the common law tradition, not those who insist on a timid acceptance of what has already been decided. To treat the law as static or to adopt an unquestioning posture toward it is to betray, not uphold, the common law tradition. Some of the best evidence for this claim can be found in, dare I say again, the common law tradition of great cases. Contrary to more conventional views that emphasize stable continuity and incremental change, great cases showcase the transformative nature of the common law tradition. Despite the insistence of its most eminent practitioners and protagonists, the common law is neither firmly grounded, objectively given, incrementally developed, nor politically neutral. As evidenced by the emergence and existence of great cases, the common law is loosely assembled, creatively constructed, unpredictably changeable, and ideologically loaded. The progress of the common law is marked less by the evolutionary unfolding of an inherent logic and characterized more by its contingent responsiveness to historical circumstances. Thus, innovation, not preservation, is the quality that most represents the tradition of the common law. Indeed, great cases change the tradition not only by adding to it but also by changing common understandings about what the past was and how it can be seen in a new light. Moreover, great cases reinforce the insight that breaking with tradition is not only a part of the common law's tradition but a defining feature of it. They demonstrate that it is not only possible to continue tradition by adapting it, but that such a judicial attitude and approach is in the very best traditions of the common law. By emphasizing that the routine is revolutionary as much as the revolutionary is routine, adjudication is treated as an institutional responsibility of both derivation and deviation. By holding up the past to a better image of itself, judges can make future changes in the name and furtherance of that present image. Such inventiveness is more a reworking of law's substantive traditions under the tutelage of a more encompassing tradition of creativity and transformation than an abandonment of tradition completely. Political repercussions. If the common law and its adjudicative practice are anything to go by, there is, as Gadamer says, something that hermeneutical reflection teaches us. However, it is not that social community, with all its tensions and disruptions, ever and ever again leads back to a common area of social understanding through which it exists. Ph 42. This is wishful thinking that does much more harm than good. It gives established and dominant values priority over marginalized and subversive ones simply because, and this is the crucial point, they are established and dominant. What hermeneutical reflection might teach us is that the extant traditions of discursive convention that make agreement possible are as much a result of force and power as of consensus and agreement. Commonality is not the same as sharedness. Such an equivalence has to be actively demonstrated rather than passively assumed. There is a politics to all of this that Gadamer either ignores or downplays. It is not so much that values and reason are entirely collapsible into ideology and power. This is a nihilistic scenario that can withstand neither historical scrutiny nor critical analysis. It is that reason and power do not stand separate from or over the other. In a similar way that values and reason operate within the context of ideology and power, so are ideology and power affected by values and reason. Contrary to much jurisprudential thinking, the problem is not the intervention of power in the halls of reason, but the resilient belief that power can be somehow excluded and that there exists some non-cultural and non-social standard of reasonableness. Disabused of this notion, the democratic ambition becomes not one of warranting that reason is detached from value or power, but of ensuring that the values and interests that help constitute reason represent and are conducive to a truly democratic society. Rhetorical knowledge, therefore, functions with, within, and upon political conditions. In legal terms, the connection between law as one kind of rhetorical activity and politics as another kind is one of interpenetration and fluidity, not independence and boundedness. In putting forward the account that I have, I am not suggesting that adjudication is somehow an unmitigated sham or that judges are involved in a dark conspiracy to thwart democratic justice. I accept that judges largely do act in good faith in meeting their professional expectations. Nor am I suggesting that the inexorable consequence of accepting that law is politics is to unveil politics and, therefore, law as an exercise in arbitrary and unreasoned decision-making. Such an account does justice neither to judges and mainstream jurists nor to me and most other critical scholars. My insistence that law is politics is no more, and no less, than a claim that it is not possible to engage in adjudication without also being drawn into and taking a stand on irreducibly contested political matters. Judges bring to their official duties what Holmes famously called deep-seated preferences. These do run very deep and are often so seated that their holder has little conscious sense of them. However, I do not believe that they cannot be argued about or that they do not change, even if they sometimes change through non-rational persuasion. I certainly do not believe that when differences are sufficiently far-reaching, we try to kill the other man rather than let him have his way or that his grounds are just as good as ours. This implies that the only alternatives to an objective rationality is a desultory relativism in which anything goes or an apocalyptic nihilism in which arbitrariness is the only mark of political commitment. These possible alternatives say more about mainstream jurists and their own limited perspectives than anything else. For them, there is no practicable choice other than objectivity or subjectivity. Anything that does not live up to the objective standards of truth is mere conviction, convention, ideology, opinion, and the like. From my critical perspective, however, Justification is a hermeneutical practice, and what works or counts as good or reasons will depend on the social and therefore political context in which justification is sought and offered. This is the unrelenting message of a radical version of Gadamerian hermeneutics. Accordingly, while I believe that such deep-seated preferences are not rational in the sense of lending themselves to some objective validation or refutation, I do not believe that they are arbitrary or immovable. Reasoned exchange and argument can occur as long as reason is understood as historically contingent, socially constructed, and politically charged. Although my critical account of common law development runs counter to traditional depictions, it is nonetheless intended to be descriptively valid. It is my claim that common law adjudication is actually performed as a dynamic exercise in which anything might go. However, my version is not entirely without precedent. The presentation of the common law as an abstract enterprise of principled elaboration is a relatively modern one. Vast efforts were made by common lawyers over many centuries to resist the deductive methods of Roman law. Indeed, the effort by many contemporary jurists to treat law and adjudication as a largely philosophical pursuit is itself something of a transformative maneuver. Nevertheless, by asking judges and lawyers to become grand theorists, they neglect the pragmatic roots and strengths of the common law, which are much more casuistic and customary than principled and formalized. It is this jurisprudential effort to represent law and adjudication as hermeneutical practices of rhetorical persuasion that is a considerable advance. However, as I have sought to demonstrate, it is important that any attempt to understand the common law as a profoundly historical endeavor must take the extra step and recognize that the historicization of the common law must also entail its politicization. It is at this point that Darwin's evolutionary sagacity can be blended effectively with Gadamer's hermeneutical insights. The common law is part of the overall human struggle to cope with the contingent and dynamic demands of the historical environment. There is no one path that people can follow and no one method on which people can rely to make a success of life. Thus, the history of the common law is not the clean and tidy process that many jurists describe or desire it to be. It is only comprehensible as a rather dirty and messy context for all that happens within its unavoidable context. In short, in seeking to take what is basically a body of practices observed and ideas received over time by a cast of lawyers and turn it into an elaborate exercise in aseptic ratiocination, mainstream jurists manage to elide the political dimensions of common law adjudication. In so doing, they misrepresent the whole quality and character of common law adjudication. Again, quite simply, there can be no historicization without politicization. In times past, the legitimacy of the common law and therefore the authority of judges was taken as residing in the fact that the common law was an artifact of the community whose values the judges were entrusted to articulate and institutionalize. While judges had considerable discretion in performing this task, they were not completely left to their own devices. The common law comprises a process whereby its rules can be updated and refreshed in accordance with changing social norms. As long as those customary values were fairly homogeneous and broadly based, the pragmatic judicial effort to combine formal law and customary values appears to be relatively apolitical and neutral. However, once that fact or pretense is relaxed, the cogency of such a claim soon begins to unravel. It is true that, until quite late in the common law's development, judges looked for guidance not from philosophical principles but from particular customs of the communities over which they presided. This meant that, in its formative Anglo-Saxon years, there was nothing common to the law as England consisted of only a fragmented, decentralized, and local series of fiefdoms. It was only in later centuries, as part of a broader centralization of governmental power, that the common law really came into existence through the blending of the diverse local customs of the different parts of England into one custom common to the whole country, by a process of judicial fusing and interpretation. However, it was never the case that the common law was simply the formalization of traditional customs. Judges always had the power to vet and veto competing customs by shaping them into a common and approved body of norms, even if those rules turned out to be unprecedented and novel. In this sense, the judges exercised a strong political discretion in favoring one set of values over another. Indeed, it is more accurate to say that the common law was less custom-based and more the common erudition of the legal profession passed off as custom. Again, it was less that judges acted as conduits for received wisdom and more that they passed off as wise those parts of customary values that they thought should be received. Law was anchored in the community, but only selectively and conditionally so. One theorist who has made some headway in this pragmatic direction is Melvin Eisenberg. Unfortunately, it is a case of 2 steps forward and 3 back. He offers a generative concept of the common law in which a combination of doctrinal principles and social propositions is effected and governed by a series of institutional rules that bind judges in the performance of their adjudicative responsibilities. These institutional principles are intended to ensure legitimacy in a democratic society. Objectivity, that is, impartial judges applying universal rules. Support, that is, these universal applied rules are supported by general standards of society. Replicability, that is, they are generated by a consistent methodology that allows reliance and predictability. And responsiveness, that is, which methodology attends to professional corrective discourse about the law and its shortcomings. Viewing the common law as an activity as much as a body of rules, Eisenberg claims to explain how the common law achieves both certainty through the existence of overriding doctrinal principles and flexibility through the incorporation of social propositions. The institutional principles are claimed to be able to reconcile the tensions that arise out of law's need to utilize the past to resolve disputes and to contribute to the future by enriching the supply of legal rules. In the language of science, there is gradual as opposed to punctuated evolution. In identifying such social proposition, he concedes that this resort to social morality will not be an empirical or value-free exercise. Judges are to draw upon those norms that they believe would likely obtain social support and favor by all. Within such a scheme, the landmark cases of the common law do not involve an attempt by the courts to change existing social standards, but a decision by the courts to bring legal rules into congruence with existing social standards. In this way, Eisenberg offers an account of common law development that ties what the law is to what it should be, but in a way that is intended to be sufficiently disciplined and controlled to satisfy the formalist demands of mainstream jurisprudence. Expressed in such general terms, Eisenberg's dynamic account has much to recommend it. Its attempt to integrate legal rules and social values is ingenious. However, once his ideas are pushed a little further, their soundness becomes very suspect. At bottom, Eisenberg tends to refute rather than confirm his traditional hypothesis that law is not political in any deep or partisan way. At a crucial juncture, he notes that using the norms of the general community in fashioning common law rules, only works, so long as the community is not exceptionally pluralistic and the norms claim to be rooted in aspirations for the community as a whole. However, in conflicted and class-ridden societies such as the United States and the United Kingdom, this means that Eisenberg has nothing to contribute by way of explanatory justification. His theory runs out at the very point where it is most needed in the resolution of most disputed matters. He has little legal advice to offer judges in disputed matters of law. As if this were not enough, Eisenberg compounds the problem by stating that, in monitoring the interplay between social and doctrinal propositions, judges must balance social congruence, systemic consistency, and doctrinal stability. However, this does not so much resolve the traditional problem of setting off substantive justice against formal reliance as restated. He concludes that precedents should be followed if there is substantial social congruence, even though another rule would be marginally better. This is tantamount to admitting that what drives the common law is political evaluation rather than legal analysis. To put it another way, this reduces legal analysis to nothing more than political debate. This, of course, is exactly what Eisenberg and other traditional defenders of the common law are supposed to be flatly against. To state, as Eisenberg does, that judges should do what they think is politically reasonable whether it involves applying, extending, distinguishing, exceptionalizing, reformulating, or overruling existing rules is to give the whole jurisprudential game away. Consequently, although Eisenberg's account is promoted as a centrist view, it plays out as an account of the common law in which anything might go. The limits of adjudication are nothing more and nothing less than the honest personal views of individual judges about what is and is not socially acceptable or reasonable. This seems much less a formula for legal restraint than an overt invitation to political choice. In presenting adjudication in this critical light, I believe it should become clear that I am not suggesting that there is no resort to political values, only that the shared nature of those values gives the appearance that the judicial performance is objective. If there is conflict over the values to be incorporated in the law, the political nature of adjudication is simply revealed rather than hidden. It is not that politics somehow begins to intrude in what is otherwise an apolitical process. The choice to uphold the status quo or traditional values is no less and no more political than the decision to rupture or reinterpret those values in the name of an emancipatory impulse. As Gadamer is at pains to emphasize, preservation is as much a freely chosen action as are evolution and renewal. Pages 281 to 82. Any engagement with and within tradition is political in that it involves choice between competing ways of presently making the past the best future that it can be. As such, it is traditionalism that is to be deplored, not tradition itself. The allegedly uncritical preservation of static commitments is bogus because, when understood in the more radical way that I recommend, the tradition itself is so capacious, nuanced, multi-textured, motile, diffuse, and irrepressible that there is no one simple given tradition whose name it is possible to be claiming to act in. Accordingly, when the common law is politicized as well as historicized, it becomes clearer that, rather than celebrate tradition as a source of authority and meaning, it is authority that is the source of tradition's meaning. Tradition can no more ground authority or meaning than anything else. Authority and meaning, like tradition, are to be earned in the rhetorical give and take of hermeneutical exchange. Such a historical exchange is only properly appreciated when its political context is grasped, admittedly in an inevitably partial, incomplete, and contingent way. In this way, the common law is more usefully understood as a radical work in progress. Consequently, the emancipatory task of a radical hermeneutics is not exhausted in the important effort of unmasking tradition following initiatives as inevitable interventions in and of politics. Although the critical significance of this demonstration is not to be underestimated, it also important to point out the inner contradictions, negations, elisions, and tensions within the tradition so that they can be appropriated, reformulated, and worked to progressive effect. Because adjudicative decision-making is context-dependent and it is not possible to delineate the relevant context with sufficient completeness, certainty, or detail, the exercise of judicial discretion will always have been an indispensable dimension of judgment or choice. The judge's moral values and political commitments will confound any attempt to turn legal adjudication into a largely technical and objective reckoning rather than a contestable commitment to particular values and interests. Moreover, even if it were, it is surely the case that being just is not a matter of calculation, and a democracy or politics that we simply calculate would be a terrible thing. Rather than view the critical claim that law is politics as an indictment of adjudication or as a betrayal of democracy, it's surely better to treat such an assessment as opening up the possibility for law and adjudication to meet its democratic obligations and satisfy the expectations that it places on itself to dispense justice. Judges do this best when, instead of pretending that law is bounded and objective, they neither mask their political commitments nor grind a favored political axe. They must put those values in curial place so as to interrogate and rework them better. Aware that tradition is never statically given but is always organically open to dynamic reinterpretation, judges will go on doing what they have always done, albeit more candidly and less cowardly. They will seek to make a critical accommodation with and within legal tradition by combining heresy and heritage into fruitful tension. However, what is fruitful will itself be contingent and contested so that there is no fully settled or adequate combination that can claim to be authoritative by dint of its balance or fruitfulness. To be in a state of tension is not aberrational or anomalous, it is the usual experience of life and tradition. Conclusion. In this chapter, I have sought to offer a reading of Gadamer, tradition, and the common law as works in progress. In particular, I have put forward my Gadamer, not some objective or essential Gadamer who stands over and supervises the meaning of his own text. To think that were possible would be to miss some of the most dominant themes in his work, namely the author's lack of authority, the contingency of the interpretive act, and the applicative indeterminacy of the text. My goal, therefore, has not been to argue over the correct interpretation of Gadamer's text. As he concludes in his masterly work, it would be a poor hermeneuticist who thought he could have, or had to have, the last word. p. 570. However, some jurists have not been able to resist that temptation and to put Gadamer's authority to work in supporting the adjudicative tradition of the common law. That effort has tended to blunt any political edge that a legal hermeneutics might have. When choice and contingency are thrown into the mix, the result is an unstable concoction that challenges all that is taken for granted or assumed. But it is not to be feared. On the contrary, it provides an opportunity for transformation and renewal. In contrast to its conservative sibling, a radical jurisprudence does not hedge on the subversive implications of the hermeneutical insight. It makes no artificial distinction between what is and is not up for grabs. Because everything has been constructed, everything can be deconstructed and reconstructed. By failing to politicize the historical imperative of hermeneutics, conservatives apprehend more benign and accidental forces at work in social life than is the case. They mistake commonality for sharedness and acquiescence for acceptance. In law, this means that legal reasoning must be treated as being as much about political power as it is about ethical consensus. The common law is thoroughly and relentlessly a work in progress. Like Darwin, Gadamer is at least partially to blame for the reception given to his work. There is a fatalistic as well as a quietistic aspect to Gadamer. He comes close to insisting that things are simply the way they are and that there is little that can be done other than to accept it. I have tried to argue that not only can Gadamer be read in a more radical style, but also that social, legal, and hermeneutical traditions are much more transformative and less determinate than Gadamer or his jurisprudential disciples allow. The willingness of many social and legal theorists to suppress such dynamism in favor of a stable status quo is itself but a rhetorical device. Contrary to the fearful scholarship of Gadamer and his conservative interpreters, this acknowledgement is not a precursor to chaos or anarchy. It is an invitation to challenge the status quo, to change the world for the better, and to argue constantly about what better is and demands. Most importantly, my effort to advocate a radical hermeneutics is most definitely not intended to demonstrate how meaning and understanding are impossible. On the contrary, it is devoted to showing how meaning and understanding are possible at all by elucidating the historical processes, social practices, and material interests within which meaning and understanding arise. The critical dimension is on tracing the political consequences of meaning's endless instability, not the frankly ludicrous project of demonstrating meaning's impossibility. As the next chapter evidences, constitutional law is one of the locations at which it is possible to demonstrate the extent to which both the substantive rules and the judicial mentality that creates and applies them are works in progress.